Hi, thank you, Savega, and thank you, Danis, for having me here. So my name is Wilson Wong. I'm head of Insight and Futures at the CIPD, and I work for an organization that is over 100 years old. So it has a stake in the future. I won't tell you very much about the CIPD. I'm assuming that most of you would have heard of it, the Chartered Institute of Personnel and Development. One of the things about working for the CIPD that I really enjoy is that it tries very hard to look after its employees by championing better work and working lives. And my role at the CIPD is to look at data. So I'm unapologetically a geek. But I also am very interested in how that supports long-term strategy. So in the context of the knowledge investments that the Institute makes, I look after the insight on changing context. So I don't particularly look at HR specifically, but as you know, the future of work is ever changing, ever evolving, and that affects your function. And one of the things that I'm very particular about, and it's a very clear message we send to our members, is that your practice should be evidence-based. And what I mean by that is that you look for the best available evidence to support the decisions you take. And that could be empirical studies, academic literature, it could be feedback from your stakeholders, your own experiential learning, and organizational data. And these are the 6 steps that we recommend to our members that they take in order to make better decisions. Now I'm going to involve you in a bit of audience participation. Now, how many of you have an idea about the job tenure? And this is taken from OECD data. So in the OECD, which is a group of developed countries, what is the general trend for the average job tenure in the last 10 years? Do you think job tenure has gone up? Do you think job tenure has declined? Or do you think job tenure in the last 10 years has been more or less the same? So I'm just going to ask you for a show of hands. Who thinks the average job tenure in the last 10 years, looking at data from the OECD from 2006 to 2016, has gone up? 1, 2, 3. Who thinks it has gone down? Okay, many. Who thinks it's more or less the same? Okay, a few. So this is the data. Apart from Finland, there is a general trend that it's going up, ever so slightly, ever so slightly. Why do I ask you this question? You've made an assumption. Have you looked at the data? And these assumptions are important because they shape our reality. It is these assumptions that we use to make decisions, to make policy. This is the other part that is interesting for me. This is the purpose of my PhD, looking at the psychology of time. And if you look at how we look at time and how we plan forward, we always overweight the present and underweight the future. How many of you have ever gone on a diet? Okay, same here. It's much easier to have lovely food in front of you and go, I'll postpone it. I'll start tomorrow. Never mind that in 1 year's time, it will show up on my hips. So we're not very good at structuring the future. We discount it. And all the things that are nice for you are usually bad for you. In my role as a futurist for the CIPD, I don't just look at trends around artificial intelligence. You've heard about blockchain. Those are technological drivers which will shape our world. I also have to look very carefully at the past and the drivers shaping society in the future. Because many things that happened in the past, many decisions taken in the past, continue to shape our future. I'll give you an example. The fact that the British had an empire and spread English all over the world. The fact that one of its largest ex-colonies is America, a superpower. This has shaped the way we communicate. This is why I'm speaking to you in English. I could very well have been speaking to you in Mandarin or Spanish, but historical trends have shaped those kinds of discourses. And when I work with organizations on possible futures, one of the things I ask them is, how much risk are you prepared to take? How much change are you willing to suffer? What is your pain threshold? If your pain threshold is not especially high, we look at probabilities, linear futures, looking at trends. If you are very, very uncertain about the shape of your industry, you look much wider. You look at what things around you can disintermediate, can destroy your future. As Charles Handy said, when you're sitting in the pub, you've missed the turning, it's too late. How many of you recognize this phenomenon? How many of you have bosses who come to you and say, don't come to me unless you have options for me to consider? Never mind the issue. Never mind the data behind the questions that must be asked. I just want a solution. Now, that is a very dangerous process because you're asking for a solution to a question that you haven't properly investigated. So you may be doing something that actually makes the situation worse. So the first thing I do as a data geek, of course, is what is your question? And I give this an example. So if I'm interested in the cost of energy, I look at all the things that shape the cost of energy. I look at the data. And then I try to find out what other factors I may have missed by speaking to my other networks. Today, one of the things I want to share with you is a piece of research that I did in Singapore with the Human Capital Leadership Institute. The brief there was to look at scenarios in Singapore that would shape the future of talent for them. It is one of those countries where they believe in futures, but they also believe in long-term planning for their workforce. And in Singapore, workforce planning is done at a national level. So these are the techniques that we use. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on them. Delphi is a futures technique, trend analysis, and then building scenarios so that you can test some of your assumptions. We look at some of the trend data. These are fairly standard. But one of the interesting things that we found in Singapore, and many of you would have heard of Singapore as a miracle economy. It has only had 2 recessions in the last 50 years. So it would, as you would imagine, be an example of a very successful economy, a very well-planned, well-run economy, and that it is. But it has a price. And one of the things that I'm going to focus on is on the culture. So if you're in an economy with full employment, where the emphasis is on the quality of your credentials, what you have is a population who, when they have those credentials, if I have a good master's from Harvard, I would expect in Singapore to walk into a good job, a good, safe, secure, stable job. That breeds a sense of entitlement. it breeds complacency, it also affects your appetite for risk. So the government does recognize this, and as part of its conversation about what it needs to do to develop its talent, it's changing its own education system and the way it recognizes talent. And this research was part of a conversation piece to bring together all the policymakers to discuss what they could do to incentivize risk-taking, creativity, and so on. These were the four scenarios that were created from that research. The first one is baseline, so it looks at trend data only, and that some of the things will be dialed up and some of the trends at the present will be dialed down. In scenario 2, we looked at Singapore as a source of professional services in Southeast Asia, having its professional class disintermediated by technology. So we look at technology as a principal driver shaping that economy. In the third scenario, we looked at Fortress Singapore. And remember, these scenarios were worked out with experts in Singapore in 2015. How was I to know that the US would vote for a president that wanted to build walls? So now we have a possibility of Fortress Singapore being played out, where countries choose protectionism over globalization. And since in scenario 4, we looked at how Singapore, like Europe post-war, uses both its capital and its expertise to rebuild Southeast Asia's economy so that it has a long-term base for its of markets, but also a long-term base for security. Now, the implications shared through all the studies was that there were questions about the role of the state, the nature of power and ethics in those societies. There were questions around fairness, what constitutes it in future. And at an organizational level, more concerning, there were issues about talent mobility and the ever-present question about knowledge and skills. And in those scenarios, these were the issues that we had to explore in the context of Singapore's talent capital. So we looked at the notion of artificial intelligence. How would that disintermediate some of the professional services in Singapore? Questions about surveillance and privacy, the rights of citizens, the choices that leaders have to make, what kind of leadership styles, what kind of leadership capabilities will be necessary in those kinds of economies, and the shape of governance to come. And we live in very interesting times where the question of governance is itself being challenged. Now, what has that got to do with HR? Now, if you don't know where you want to go, it doesn't matter what you do. One of the things that I found very interesting in working with organizations is that most of us work in organizations that look at maximum 3-year plans. Very linear. You're looking at trend data, you're adding 10% here, cutting off certain departments and functions. It's a very linear process. But what you don't have is a vision of where you could be, where you'd like to be. What are the externalities that you need to look at? What other adjacent or different industries could cannibalize your business? So I've given you an idea of the tools that I use in helping organizations reimagine and imagine their futures. So what they could be in 10 years' time. But supporting that and to bring it back to home for you as HR practitioners, this is what some organizations use in terms of operational workforce planning. And these are tools that are available to you right now. So for some of you, the future is right here. And what I wanted to use, just by way of illustration, is how this, using data from your workforce, careful questions about what is important to you, you can monitor indigenous representation. That means you're concerned about your diversity and inclusion question. You're looking at your aging workforce. What are you doing in terms of maintaining their capability and well-being? You're also, of course, looking at areas of over and undersupply against your 3-year plan. So where do you want to be in 3 years to achieve that vision in 10? And the reason I use this as an illustration is because this kind of way of looking at workforce mix allows you to do scenario modeling. So what if? What if I need more data people? What if I need more capability? What if I move people around the world? So this gives you an idea of both the capability required, the regional locations that they are needed in, and the kinds of possible models of workforce that you could work from given your long-term vision. A 3-year plan won't give you this because you need to know where you're going and where the likely threats are going to be long-term. And there are other tools that will help you think through some of these questions. And this is another hat I wear. I chair the Human Capital Standards Committee for the UK. And I would like to think that by setting out some of these international ISO standards in human capital management, I am helping to build that future. So there is a workforce planning standard which doesn't tell you what to do, but it tells you what you need to think about in doing your workforce planning. And as a sneak preview, this standard on human capital reporting is going to be published at the end of the year. This requires organizations to publish human capital information in their annual reports. I think there are 12 dimensions. And I would imagine that in the next decade, as more and more organizations begin to report on their human capital, these standards could be very influential and will shape your function. And of course, I'm sure you've been to many conferences where you have people talking to you about how they assemble people data, the kinds of questions and governance requirements that you have around people's data. And these are some of the tools that you have at your disposal. So just to conclude, why do we do futures in building your long-term strategy? You want to provide corporate conversation. You want to have a vocabulary that you can talk across functions. You want to be able to prioritize as a whole organization. And then together identify the opportunities and risks for your business going forward. Not in the next year or two, although that is important, but looking at the long-term viability and resilience of your business. And then, of course, translating that into your workforce strategy. And the use of futures allows you to test some of your assumptions using data, but also using some of your planning tools that I've described. This way, you will then see where the red flags lie, where the risks are, and build the necessary contingency for your own organization's continued success. How many of you know this man? Great. So he's a fellow Brit, and he said this: the greatest obstacle to discovery is not ignorance, but the illusion of knowledge. And as you go into a data-driven, evidence-based way of practicing HR, think about this man and what he said, that those numbers could be very misleading. That's my kind of parting shot. Because when I went to investigate who actually said this, I found out it was a guy called Daniel Borstein, who was a librarian at the US Congress. So even though on the internet it says that he said it in 2001, in 1984, this librarian used the phrase first. So part of the message is never trust what I say, and also make sure that you check the evidence. Thank you.